host, you need to enable me to share the screen, Martin. Okay. So this is probably mostly for James, if you haven't encountered this, but we commence with these 4 thoughts that turn the mind towards the Dharma. Or another way of expressing it is the 4 thoughts that turn the mind away from samsara, the dissatisfactoriness of cycling existence. So we'll have a pause in between each one and just briefly just reflect on the sense of each thread. Nama Jeno, Nama Jeno, Nama Jeno, Nama. Take care of us, guide us, inspire us, make us one with you. Now I have this unique opportunity, a free and well-favored human form, so difficult to find. But it will not last forever. Death can come at any moment. And wherever I'm born, in samsara, there will be suffering. For both virtuous and harmful actions, karma's cause and effect cannot be escaped. Olam, hold us with your compassion so that we may find the path to liberation. And now we will recite the refuge prayer twice in the Tibetan indicated by the phonetics, and then the 3rd time in English. Dagi gonde jipe zonanji rola benjil sonje drumrajo sonje jodan zoji jonam lam changju badu dani jamrushi Dagi gonde jipe zonanji rola benjil sonje dru parajo. Buddha, the Dharma, and the noblest Sangha, I take refuge until enlightenment is reached. Through the virtue generated by this meditation and practice, may I achieve Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. So, before I hand over to Martin, may I thank him very much for agreeing to teach online to us, and I'm hopeful that next time we see him will be in the flesh, assuming that we can return to our usual meeting hall. So Martin has also kindly agreed to do some dedication at the outset for a number of our dear members who have had a challenging time of late. So over to you, Martin. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bob. Cheers, and welcome to everybody. So yes, as Bob said, I'd like to just begin by chanting what's called a Dharani, which, sorry, I think somebody's not quite muted, and I'm getting some feedback. I think Kate. and I think Martin's iPad as well. So I can, okay, hold on a second. There we go. Okay, I'm going to, thank you very much. Cheers. So yes, so I'm going to chant. It's called the Dharani for removing disasters, and it's a general protection Dharani. And so before we begin, I dedicate this chanting for the benefit of all of us, of this Sangha. May we all be protected. May we all be happy. May we all attain Buddhahood. Namu samanda motona no harachi kotosha sononan tojito en gyak 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 unnun shifura shifura hara shifura hara shifura chishus chishus shushiri shushiri sohaja sohaja Sichik Shiri Somaka Namu Samanda Motona no Harachi Kotosh Sononando Jito En Gya 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 Ki Gya Ki Annan Shifura Shifura Hara Shifura, Hara Shifura, Chishusa, Chishus, Shushiri, Shushiri, Sohaja, Sohaja, Sechik, Shiri, Somaka, Namu, Samanda, Otona, no Harachi, Kotosh, Sononan doji doem ya 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 gi ya ki shifura shifura hara shifura hara shifura chishus chishus shushiri shushiri sohaja sohaja sechigya shiri somako. And I think, as we normally do, just to begin with, we'll have 10 minutes meditation, and then we'll start with our talk for tonight. So if you'd like to just get into position, get yourself ready, and we'll just have 10 minutes. I'll signal the beginning and also bring us back at the end. Okay. So I think we'll follow our usual format. So we'll have the talk, and we'll have another break for some sitting meditation, and then we'll have Q&A, and that will take us up to 9 o'clock, which I think will be enough for us all probably by then. So you can hear. You hear me okay?
Breaking up a little.
No?
I think it's okay.
All right, thank you. Right. So the title of this talk is Love, the Glue That Holds the Universe Together. And first of all, happy Valentine's Day to everybody. And obviously that was why this title was in fact pinched, a very un-Buddhist thing, but I actually pitched this title because it was the title of a talk that was given many years ago by Christmas Humphreys at the Buddhist Society. Christmas Humphreys being famously the founder of the Buddhist Society in London, the very first Buddhist society that was established in the whole of Europe, in fact, in the early 20s. So in fact, they're just coming up to their centenary. And for this talk, really, I wanted to cover a number of issues or a number of subjects around, what is love? I mean, we think of love very much in our human context, but love really is an attractive force. It's a force that binds things together or brings things together. It even forms the basis of a term like samadhi. Samadhi, which refers to the state of meditation. So, for example, the term samadhi itself is often translated as oneness, and it has the interpretation of non-dual. That is, that subject and object disappear, and the natural true things, which is everything to everything else, known a little bit later, known as the imagination, which is the very heart of the is reflected through as an active force things together.
Martin, you're breaking up a little.
Puts everything in communication. Right. Okay. Okay. I think what I'll do is just give me 2 minutes. I'm just going to get. Thank you. So yes. So really, what I wanted to do was to just cover some of the aspects of that attractive force that in the human realm we could call love. In the spiritual realm, we might call samadhi or oneness or non-duality, and just look and see how the representations of this have been reflected through the teachings of the Buddha, which is obviously why we are here. And I wanted to start actually by telling a story that from the Pali Canon about the Buddha, and also obviously at the time, certainly by the time that the Buddha had established the Sangha, after he was, well established, in sort of later on in his life, he had many royal patrons, King Bimbisara, of course, being particularly famous, but there was also other kings and other royalty as well. And the story goes that there was one such king who ruled over a sort of large city-state, a king, that was his kingdom. And one evening, he and the queen were looking out of the window at all the smoke coming out of the chimneys of all the houses in the city. And what this meant, of course, was that everybody was cooking dinner, which meant that everybody had something to eat. And he was really pleased that under his rulership, that the people were not going hungry. They all had something to eat. And he turned to the queen and he said, this comes for me. He said, this is a love that I really feel for my people, and I'm really, really happy. I really do love my subjects, and I know they love me as well. And as he was saying this, suddenly a thought struck him, and he said, "Oh, I've just realized something." And the queen says to him, "What is it?" And he says, "Well, while I do love my people, and I also love you, my dear, and I also love our children. If I'm really honest, I actually love myself above everything else. And the Queen was rather shocked at this because she thought that the king loved her more than anyone else. But then she reflected on it. And then she suddenly thought, my dear, actually, what you say is true for me as well. If I'm really honest, I actually love myself more than anyone. And this perturbed them both very much. And they thought, well, it doesn't feel quite right, particularly as they were both followers of the Buddha. So they said, maybe we should go and see what he has to say about it. So they went and got an audience with the Buddha, and the Buddha listened to what happened, and he nodded and he said, well, yes, you don't need to feel ashamed about that at all. He says, to be perfectly honest, all love begins at home, rather like charity, I suppose we would say, begins with oneself. The only pity is if it stops there. He said the important thing is once we learn to love ourselves, then we can truly love others as well. And as long as that circle of self, or what we regard as, loving myself, begins to take in, open out and begin to take in others, and we expand that as much as possible, then this is skillful. This is skillful to do, but all love should start with love for oneself, one's body, one's form also, and that this is how we learn to love, but that it mustn't stop there. It must open out and take in others. I think this is very useful for us to think, because quite often we can think of love as being either or. If I just love myself, then I'm selfish, and therefore I must love everybody else, and maybe even feel that I must sort of deprecate myself. But actually, that's also a form of selfishness too, because who is it that makes that? And I remember, and again, I think I've told the story many years ago when I used to go to the Zen Sunday meetings that were run once a month at the Buddhist Society. And there was an old lady who used to come every month, actually. Very nice, very sweet little old lady. And at the end of one talk I gave, she came downstairs and she said, oh, thank you for that talk. I really enjoyed that. Really, it really struck a chord with me. I understand what you say about the Buddhists talking about the delusion of I, and that this delusion of I gets in the way, of the seeing the true nature of things, and that once this delusion has gone, then the wisdom, the prajna parameter, the wisdom gone beyond shines through, the compassion, the warmth of heart shines through as well. She said, but my problem is that I actually don't have enough ego. I don't actually have enough self in order to lay down. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, I always feel that I can't do this, or I always feel that I lack the confidence to do it. I always feel that somehow, it would be, whatever it is, it's too much of a challenge, and perhaps I'd better not. And I always feel that, I'm not very good, and I always feel that I'm not very capable. And she sort of went on like this. And when she came to the end of it, I said, well, who is it that tells you that you can't? Who is it that tells you that you have no confidence? Who is it that tells you that you are no good? Who is it that tells you that it's too much and it would overwhelm you? I said, that God Almighty one, that one who makes these God Almighty judgments, that's the I that's the self that needs to be laid down. And she looked at me, and that sort of, looking into her eyes, that sweet little old lady vanished, and there was something very cold and very steely looking out of those eyes. And she said to me, but I am rubbish. And you don't want to, that was, it was very cold. It was very cold. And there it was, that's something that went in that way, and says, so even even saying, oh, everybody else is, I love everybody else, but I am unworthy, is also just another trick of self, trick of I, as well. And that too, of course, has to be laid down. But that story of King Pasadena, which I told, and the Queen, I think is a lovely story, because it really shows that interconnectedness, that love is a force or a function. It's something that functions, and that it flows between things equally. And there's a lovely phrase in the from the Diamond Sutra, one of the classic Mahayana sutra, that says the Dharma is equal and even, neither high nor low. And yet it exists in all things, in the high and the low. It exists in the kings, and it exists in the, in the laity. It exists in the Sangha. It exists in Buddhas, and it exists in the most wicked person, equally and even. There's no difference whatsoever in terms of the Dharma between absolutely everything. And because of that, therefore, love between everything is, of course, possible. And of course, this notion of love is not just love being something that holds the universe together, or samadhi, or the dependent origination, actually is not something that is just confined to Buddhism, or even to the East, to Eastern religions. It's actually something that very much exists in the West and in Western philosophy as well. And the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung used to talk about what he called the principle of eros. Eros, of course, is the son of the Greek goddess Aphrodite, who was the goddess of love. We perhaps know Eros better as Cupid, with those bows and arrows, firing those arrows into the hearts and causing hearts to break and fall in love with each other. And he was considered somewhat mischievous as well, because of course love can be mischievous as well, as we know from many stories of love and tragedy and so forth, Romeo and Juliet and all those sorts of things as well. We know that love can be very trying and cause great difficulty. But Jung when he spoke about eros, he wasn't just talking about the mythological stories, the myths. He was talking about eros as a principle, just a general principle of attraction that exists in the human psyche, in the human mind, or in human consciousness, perhaps we could say. And he said that the eros can take one of four forms. He says, and it emerges, obviously, in the sort of early childhood, but particularly comes into the first time we really it comes to the fore is obviously at puberty, because the first level of eros is, of course, sexual attraction, and sexual attraction is, of course, very intense. It's very powerful, but somewhat like a straw fire. It burns very hot, but very quickly as well, and it can burn out very quickly as well. And it's extremely impulsive, as we know, and it can cause, obviously, were it not for sexual attraction, none of us would be here. But also untrammeled, it can also cause a great deal of a lot of problems as well, if it's completely untrammeled. Hence why we have lots of ethical codes around how, what we can do with it, so to speak. And those things are necessary. But he says after a period of time, he said it matures, and it then goes to the second level. And the second level of eros is what we know as romantic love. So literally with instead of it just being literally a genital attraction, it becomes a love or an attraction between two beings, between two personalities. Between the whole personality in its most ideal state. Of course, love can also be very blinding as well. We can fall in love with the image of somebody rather than with what they truly are. And this is perhaps more along the lines of an infatuation, which is not quite romantic love. An infatuation is something that comes that is, again, it's quite similar to sexual attraction, but we are in fact attracted to an image of somebody. And, you know, I mean, we can sort of see this, and perhaps we've experienced it ourselves, particularly maybe in our younger years, you know, where we really did, you know, we really thought we'd fallen in love with somebody, and you know, we think, oh wow, you know, absolutely want to spend all my time with my beloved or whatever, and maybe my beloved also wants to spend, you know, all the time with me as well, and we shack up together, and you know, everything is fantastic, and you know, the other person can do no wrong at all, everything is wonderful, and there's a sort of flush, you know, in our cheeks and in our eyes when we're with that other person, then we really do feel lifted up. This is the power of eros. It really lifts us up, and nothing is too much trouble, you know. Everything is possible. There's a confidence, there's an energy, there's a motivating, deep motivating force where all, you know, we're literally prepared to wait out in the snow if we have to, in order to, you know, meet with this other person. It doesn't matter what the difficulties are. I'm prepared to put up with all sorts of things, and these are the, you know, these are the love stories we read about, that the lengths that people are prepared to go to be with the one that they love. And of course, but at the beginning, what I may be in love with, of course, is just a certain image that has actually come out of consciousness or out of the psyche, and after about 6 months or so, the infatuation begins to wane. It's rather like, and so it shares that sort of, it's not quite the straw fire of sexual attraction. It lasts longer, but it still wanes. It still sort of begins to, you know, sort of wane away. And as it begins to go down, suddenly I begin to notice, you know, the empty milk bottle that's been put back into the fridge, you know, and the pile of wet towels that are always being left in the middle of the bathroom, you know, and the mess that's big. And that begins to irritate me a little bit. But I'm still clinging on to this, you know, this infatuation. I don't want to let it go because it's so lovely. And so, you know, it opens me up, which really I want. But in the end, I can't ignore these things anymore. So I say to my beloved, you know, we better have a house meeting. There's 1 or 2 things I need to say to you for the good of the relationship. So is that. And of course, what we find, so we have the house meeting, and I have my bit of paper with my sort of list of gripes, all the things that now I expect you to take notice of. And what I discover, to my horror, is not only are you not particularly interested in my gripes about you, but you have a list of gripes about me as well, for the good of the relationship. And now we come to this sort of point where a choice has to be made. Am I going to stick with this, with my ideal? And now you no longer fit that ideal, so you have to go. And now I look for someone else that I can plonk my ideal on top of, and then fall and have that same infatuation with them, and then repeat that whole process. Or do we sort of mature into that genuine love for another person, where we not only love them on balance, we find that we love them, we accept that they have warts and all, but we're prepared to live with that as well. And maybe I'm going to have to make a few adjustments as well to the way that I live, because on balance, actually, the relationship is worth it, and I'm going to go through with it. And you know, those choices we make. You know, if we find, and we all have that ideal, you know, the ideal of the romantic love that gets projected out, and if the other person doesn't fit it well enough, then you know, we will judge the relationship as not being sufficient, and we will move on, obviously. And of course, that can change over time as well. So even between 2 people, so even people who've been together for quite some time may come to a point where they drift apart, and you know, that is a natural thing too. That obviously, that's something that happens. So that was the second level of eros. So again, to begin with, we have the sexual attraction, which is the pure physical side. It doesn't take into account the personality at all, doesn't have to. And then we have the romantic side, which through this process of maturing then does take into account the being, the person, the personality, and there's a sort of coming together, there's a melding and the forming of a relationship, where the relationship is now seen as being higher than the two individuals as well. So it's not a case of I subvert myself for the other, or the other subverts itself for me. We both become secondary, and the relationship becomes primary. So that becomes the thing that that holds us together. So then the third, as it were, transmutation of eros is into the realm of the ideals. And when Jung talked about it, he said a classic thing, for example, would be patriotism, one's love for one's country. But that's certainly not the only ideal. Obviously, there's lots of idealisms around now. Some of them are political. Some of them are, maybe something a little bit more local, for example. But it doesn't matter. I mean, if you take patriotism, that's a good one. So that is where, we develop a love of a larger group, basically. We begin to care for the other as we care for ourselves. And that might have to do with well-being or justice or all sorts of things as well. So that would be the third level. And of course, that can also mean laying down my life as well, for my country. That takes into account that level of eros too. And then the fourth level is spiritual. So the fourth level then perhaps takes us a little bit more into that level of spiritual wisdom and also spiritual insight. And obviously, as Buddhists, this brings us on to another saying of the Buddha as well. One of the most profound teachings or the most profound teaching of the Buddha that he gave in the Pali Canon, in the early teaching, of course, was the teaching of what is called the Praticca Samutpada, what's known as the arising due to conditions, or sometimes just known as dependent origination. Sometimes it's called a 12-link chain of arising due to conditions. And if you look at the wheel of life, you'll see on the rim of the wheel there are 12 pictographs, and those 12 pictographs are the 12 links of the Praticca Samutpada, or dependent origination. And basically, you can look those 12 links up, and there's articles and books around them, and you can look those up. But basically, the essence of that teaching is that everything that exists is dependent for its existence on something else. So therefore, nothing can exist in isolation. And so what this means is that everything exists in relationship. And it's the relationship that is the primary reality. The parts that make up the relationship are secondary. It's the relationship between everything that becomes the most important thing. And of course, this teaching was taken to a sort of an apotheosis in Mahayana when it becomes the teaching of Shunyata, because it's from the teaching of, obviously the teaching of no I, but it is because of the teaching of dependent origination that the teaching of emptiness can come about. Now, the interesting thing about the teaching of emptiness is that it sounds very negative, and indeed it's couched in a sort of negative term. We say emptiness, don't we? And sometimes even worse, I think, as its Shunyata is translated into English as void, which makes it sound like some sort of sucking in black hole that just sucks everything into it. And that is absolutely not what emptiness means. What emptiness means, what Shunyata means, is is empty of a separate self, empty of separation, that nothing is separate from everything else, because the very concept of a self, the very concept of an I at the root is that I am self-contained, self-supporting, self-creating, self-perpetuating, and I'm not reliant on anyone or anything outside of myself. So I can cause things to happen, or things can happen to me, but I am, as it were, a separate and isolated thing. And the Buddha said no. He said actually that is a delusion, and shunyata is that not only are we empty of any separate self, but also so is everyone and everything as well. And what that emptiness means, therefore, is not that all that there is nothing, all that there is complete, like void at the center of everything. No, what it means is that everything is connected. In this, if there is no self, if there's no separate self, then the only other remainder, the only thing that remains is that interconnectedness, that sense of samadhi, oneness with absolutely everything. And this is why the Buddha said to, because one day after the Buddha had been teaching the Pratichat Samutpada, Ananda, the faithful Ananda, who was the Buddha's cousin and also his sort of right-hand monk and assistant, he said, he said, that was amazing. And he said, I really got it. He said, honestly, Lord, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, it doesn't quite say that in the Sanskrit, in the Pali. He said, I really got it. He said, I really do understand the Pratichat Samutpada. And the Buddha replied, he said, say not so, Ananda, say not so. He who sees into the truth of the Pratichat Samutpada sees directly the Dharma. And he who sees the Dharma sees directly the truth of the Pratichat Samutpada. So that's how central it was. That's how important that sense of dependent origination, that sense of interconnectedness goes all that way through. And so, having sort of understood that, or having been given that even intellectually by the Buddha, this idea that there's an interconnectedness between everything, and a constant relating between everything. What my own teacher used to call, I look at the flower and the flower looks at me. I listen to the music and the music listens to me. This is that reciprocity. That's how in the Mahayana, that's how it began to become expressed. So I thought perhaps we could look a little bit at some of the sort of ramifications. What does it mean to live in a universe where the true nature of everything is this interrelatedness between everything, and that the appearance or of things of you and I being separate is actually false. It's actually a delusion, and this is what the Buddha taught. Let's be absolutely clear. So what does that mean? Well, again, there's a lovely story of the Chinese rainmaker, which I think gives another example of it. And obviously my own my own Buddhist school is Zen, and Zen obviously originated in China, and Zen certainly took on a lot of the sort of the way of seeing that was very Chinese, but was also that dovetailed very nicely in with the Buddha Dharma as well. And so the story goes that there was a certain province of China a long time ago, and they had been the rains hadn't come, and things were getting pretty bad, and it was getting close to the fact that the crops would fail if there was no rain. So things were getting pretty scary. So they did what they always did. They prayed and they made sacrifices to the gods, but nothing happened. They called in the magicians and they cast their spells to make it rain, and that didn't work either. So it was really becoming very critical now. And so the governor of the province heard through the grapevine that in a distant province there was a very famous rainmaker And so he thought, well, we must send for him. And so they did send for him, and the rainmaker came. And as he alighted from his carriage, the governor met him and greeted him and said, look, we've got this terrible problem. And if we don't get the rain soon, the crops are going to fail, and then we'll have famine. So things are going to get considerably worse. Please, you must help us. And the rainmaker said, well, I'll see what I can do. He said, I can't promise anything. It's not always 100%, but I will see what I can do. And as he looked around, he saw that there was a house up on a hill. And he said, could I borrow that house just for 3 days? And I will stay there. And they said, yes, of course. So off the rainmaker went. He sort of closed the door inside, and they didn't see him for 3 days. And at the end of that time, the clouds suddenly gathered. There was a clap of thunder and a flash of lightning, and the heavens just opened, and the rain fell. And of course, everybody was delighted. So, there was a procession headed by the governor, went up to the house, and they sort of knocked on the door, and the rainmaker sort of opened the door and sort of came out and said, yes. And they said, thank you. Disaster has been averted. We now have the rain. We can't thank you enough. And he said, what do you mean? Well, they said, you said you wanted 3 days. You've had 3 days, and it's raining. He said, oh, I didn't do that. He said, well, you must have done. He said, no, I didn't. You see, you don't quite understand how all this works. He says, I don't make anything happen. He said, you see, where I come from, everything happens as it's supposed to happen. When the sun's supposed to shine, then it shines. When it's time for it to rain, then it rains. And the people are the same as well. They do everything when they're supposed to, and they're in harmony. What he said was they're in harmony with what he called the Tao. But when I came here, I noticed that you were all out of sorts with each other. Everything is sort of just not quite right. And of course, when I stepped out of the carriage and set foot on your ground, I too became infected with that being out of harmony, being out of sorts. And I realized that if I could do anything at all, then I must put my own heart back in order again. And that's the best that I can do. And that's all that I've been doing whilst I've been staying in this house. Whatever else has happened as a result of it is nothing to do with me. It's a really interesting story, because from our point of view, being very sort of extroverted as a society, and also being very full of ourselves as well, we think that we always have to act on the world, that if we're going to do any good to the world, I must act upon it in this way. But actually, this level of spiritual eros, this interconnectedness, allows quite a different way of acting in the world, which is, if you like, more indirectly. It recognizes that each of us has an effect. If we are all truly interconnected, then what goes on inside of us, whether we say anything about it or not, affects everything around us. In fact, ultimately affects every single corner of the world as well. So it matters what we say, what we think, and how we act as well. Whether it's inside or outside, it matters. And this is really is the essence of this particular story, and it's reflected actually in, as I said, he used the term in the story. He uses the term the Tao. And the Tao, of course, is something that was used by China. I mean, it's not true to say that Taoism is the same as Buddhism. They're not the same, and the concept of the Tao is not quite the same as the concept of the Dharma. But it is true to say that a lot of the Chinese Buddhist masters used to use the word Tao interchangeably with the term Dharma. That is that the Dharma is the inherent law or the true nature of the universe, was often referred to as the Tao. So there was that sort of, crossover. And one of the most famous texts of Taoism, which I'm sure many of you will know, is the Tao Te Ching. And in the 25th chapter of the Tao Te Ching, at the very end, the verse at the very end really sums this relationship and this harmony up, because it says, man obeys the laws of earth obeys the laws of heaven obeys the laws of Tao, and the Tao obeys its own inherent nature. And the notion there is that in the sphere of man, or we would say humans, in the realm of the human, if the human relates to the human things that we relate to every day, and we relate to it properly in accordance with the Tao, then we are relating in accordance to the whole of the Tao, wherever it is in the whole of the universe. Now, to the feeling of a separate self, that is absolutely nonsense. That is completely impossible. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But in a truly interconnected universe, that is absolutely possible. That is absolutely the case, 100%. And so it matters, therefore, whether we do our own training. It matters, therefore, not just to me, and not even just to the people around us, but actually it matters to the whole universe, to the whole of history, to everything that we do. And I remember my own late teacher, Venerable Myokyoni, once saying, she trained in Japan in a very traditional Japanese monastery called Daitokuji in Kyoto from 1960 to 1972, when she was given permission to come back to England to teach. And obviously, because she was there for 12 years, she got to know the monks there. And, she said there was a small group of particularly talented monks there. And there was one in particular who was spiritually extremely gifted and had great wisdom. And everybody expected, because this would be the normal thing, everybody expected him that when he finished his training, he would probably head one of the really big temples in a city where there was lots of parishioners, lots of people who were wanting to practice, meditation and do koan training and all that sort of thing. But he didn't. He found the smallest, remotest temple out in the sticks somewhere, and he requested to become the incumbent of that particular temple. And somebody said to him, well, aren't you wasting your time? Wouldn't it be better if you were teaching people, a large sort of group of lay people who were really dedicated to the Buddha Dharma, really wanted to train? Wouldn't it be better to be actively teaching them? What are you going to do? He said, well, I will have a few parishioners in this small temple, but you're right. After I probably do a few chores during the day, but apart from that, I will just sit zazen. I will just sit meditation in the mountains. And they sort of said, well, isn't that a bit selfish? And he said, no. He said, because what I will be doing is transforming the atmosphere of the world. So for him, his own insight had led him to see that actually, even when we sit zazen, we're not just sitting it for myself. We're sitting it for the benefit of all beings. Every time we sit down, every time we do it, we're not just doing it for my own well-being. We're doing it for the benefit of all beings. And this is why at the end, we at the end of meetings like this, or when we do our sitting practice or our chanting practice, or our daily life practice, we always remind ourselves by remembering that we dedicate this merit for the benefit of all beings. The truth is, though, there's no other way to do this but by dedication. The dedication simply reminds us that this is the way it works. In a truly interconnected universe where everything reflects everything else, then it's impossible to do anything that doesn't also reflect all other parts of the universe at one and the same time. It really is quite a mind-blowing concept, and it should be. It should be truly not just mind-blowing, but eye-blowing as well, because this is something that no eye can. We may even feel it, but my goodness, no eye can truly comprehend this. And this is why the insight of the Buddha's enlightenment left him speechless, because how is that truly possible to put that that experience of reality so fundamentally into words and explain it to anyone else? Another story that comes to mind about this, actually, which also happened, was so when Myokyoni was training in Japan, the head monk there at the time was a man called Soko Morinaga, who would later become a Roshi, Zen master in his own right. But he told an interesting story. So he had a very severe teacher, a very strict teacher called Master Zuigen. And when Sesso was he was a senior monk at the time, and he was in Zuigen's temple. And one day he came into the master's quarters, and there was a table, a small lacquer table, and there was a vase of flowers on it. And somebody had spilt, or someone who probably been topping up the vase with water, had actually spilt water onto the lacquer table, which of course would ruin the lacquer table if it's left there. And as he saw it, Master Zuigen came in through the other door, saw the water on the table, saw Soko Morinaga, and scolded him for spilling the water on the table. But Soko Morinaga said, well, but it wasn't me. I've just walked in like you, just this very minute. And Zuigen scolded him again for, trying to point the finger away from himself towards someone else. And this really left Soko Morinaga very perplexed. I mean, he was used to being scolded. This happens all the time. It wasn't that, but he knew that Zuigen now knew the truth, that it wasn't Soko that had spilt the water, yet he had scolded him for telling him that. Why did he do that? And this really bugged him. And you know how it is when something really bugs you like that. I mean, it's bad enough, when you're guilty of something, but when you've been accused and you've not been guilty of it, it's even harder to really stomach. And so this sort of stuck with him. Anyway, later on that day, he had to go on an errand into town. So he's walking down the pavement, and there was a little alleyway to the side of him, just in front. And as he was walking up to the alleyway, suddenly dashing out in front of him came this little boy who was being chased by a little girl. And as the little boy ran in front of him, he tripped on a paving stone and went down really hard like this. And the little girl behind him went, ow, like that. And in that moment, he understood what Zuigen had been trying to show him. It's an interesting thing. I mean, we all do it, don't we? Someone traps their finger in the door or stubs their foot. We go, "Ooh, I felt that," don't we? I mean, we've all had that experience. But have we ever stopped to wonder what makes that experience possible? Because the truth is, I couldn't feel that. I mean, if you stubbed your toe, I don't actually feel it, but yet in a funny way, I do feel it. So as well as this consciousness that feels myself to be separate from everything, there's another consciousness that actually allows us to have empathy, to actually empathize with the suffering of others. I mean, I've had this experience myself. I live in London, and I use the tube, and I'm sure you'll know you have those big escalators, and you stand on the right and people walk down on the left. And I remember once sort of standing, because I always stand, so I was just standing going down, and someone was in a rush, was coming past me, and they tripped. And before thinking, I mean, it never even occurred, before thinking, I just put my hand out and grabbed them like that to prevent them falling. But the question is, why would I do that? Because if they fall and hurt themselves, what's that to me? What, you know, it's not going to hurt me. They're the one that gets hurt or injured or whatever. Why would I care? Why should I care? Well, the reason that we care is because there is this other consciousness that actually sees ourselves being connected with and affected by others and what happens to others. That's why we are not indifferent, and we can't be indifferent. And in fact, if you meet someone who is totally indifferent, well, Bob will tell you that's called psychopathology. And such people are regarded as psychopaths. And actually, that's a pathological state where a person truly doesn't feel any empathy whatsoever for others. But it's very rare. Or I believe it's very rare. And we certainly don't consider it to be healthy. The healthy state is actually that we do feel this empathy. We do have this consciousness that feels, that naturally feels connected. Now, on top of that, we can be selfish. On top of that, we can say, well, I don't care. On top of that, we can be very limited and say, well, I'll only care about these people, but not those people. But that misses the point. The point is that that consciousness is there, and it does operate according to that nature, not this separate nature. And so we have these, as it were, this sort of layered effect in the psyche or in the heart, in consciousness itself. And because of that, we are able to feel compassion for others as a result. It is through that ability to feel empathy, it's through that ability to be able to put ourselves into the shoes of the other person and the other person into our shoes, that actually we can feel compassion as a result of that. And this, I would argue, is exactly the same function. That is that eros function, but in its spiritual state. Because, of course, for the bodhisattvas operate universally. They do not discriminate between this and that. They feel compassion universally to all beings. And that's their vow. After all, the great bodhisattva vow is sentient beings are numberless. I vow to assist them all. And that vow to assist them all is not to say, but I'll assist some more than others. It's that feeling, and to know that it comes from this wisdom of being able to see, they see themselves as being inherently interconnected with everything and everyone else. So that compassion is a perfectly natural outflow of that way of seeing. That's the point here. That's the point with this love, which is the glue that binds that universe together. So I think I'm going to leave it there, because I think that covers most of the major points that I really wanted to cover for this talk. So I think what I'd like to do, we'll just have a little quiet sit for 10 minutes, and then we'll just finish off with a few questions, if that's okay. Okay, so I think we've got a few minutes if we want to have any questions. Floor's open.
Well, I'll kick off. There'll be many to follow me in asking questions. Martin, thank you so much for a lovely talk, punctuated with, gosh, this was Martin at his best. Wealth of anecdotes. that illustrates so well this teaching. And the awareness that you were, or rather, that elderly lady, the lovely lady who turned quite sharp, you are asking her, who is telling her that she's no good, etc. This is the same awareness you're referring to that makes us aware of other people's, well, you're grabbing for the person about to fall down escalators. It's that sort of awareness, is it? This is...
No, this is so there's a God Almightiness in that. So there's this inner judge that's that can, in some people, becomes overweeningly critical.
Yeah.
And often not with oneself only, quite often with others as well. But if it gets turned on oneself like this, and quite often you find this, so in people who, in her case, she had said, oh, I really don't feel capable. I don't have confidence. I'm not this. I have low self-esteem. I don't have much of a, because she had this notion that selfish people, or should I say egotistical people, show off and boast and say, I am the best, I am the greatest, shut up, I'm speaking, I am right, you are wrong. But actually, it also works the other way around as well, because there's such people have the God Almighty complex on the outside, so to speak. Don't you speak, I will say, I tell the truth, my way, all that sort. But in fact, for people who have very low self-esteem, there's also an extremely powerful critic and judge on the inside that says, shut up, you are not worthy, you can't do this, you mustn't try that, that's dangerous, are you fool, you're silly. And that is the same voice, that is the same God Almighty. So there's this God Almighty complex, and the God Almighty complex is I. That's the self belief. That is the notion of. That's why I said to her, that is the notion of self that has to be laid down. So for the boastful person, it might be to learn a little bit of right speech, for example. If they were, let's say, I always talk over you. No, Bob, no, you don't. No, you don't. And I never let you speak, or whatever. Then a little bit of right speech discipline begins to pull that egoism in. But in her case, she was enthralled to this inner critic. So this inner critic dominated her and forbade her to do all these things. And that is I. It's exactly the same, but it's just the other way round. So the consciousness that sees the connection with everybody. I mean, obviously she had that too. She was a very nice lady. I don't want to give the wrong impression. She was very kind, and she would, she brought things. She would sometimes, make some cakes or biscuits or whatever, and then bring them. And she had real pleasure in sharing them. And when someone ate one of her biscuits and smiled and said, oh, that's really nice, she felt good, Now, you may sort of say, oh, well, isn't that selfish? That the cynic probably would. But it misses the point. The point is that by giving something, she took pleasure in it. By giving something to someone else, she took pleasure in it. Now, some people can get addicted to that as well. But underneath that, there's something that, and that's what I mean about the hand that goes out, that before thinking that you just grab somebody, you just say, no, whoa, right, like that. It functions before any I consciousness, before any I thinking, because it's always there, and it's part of the fundamental nature of the human heart. But it's and this is the bit that sort of allows for the compassion. But the point is, because we can do that, because we have the power of empathy, even if we screw it up sometimes, the fact that it exists shows that this consciousness that connects us also exists. That's the point. I don't know, does that make sense?
It does, and thank you very much for clarifying the distinction. I think I was confused about the initial example, and now I see that this is why it is reported the Dalai Lama said to the New York hot dog vendor, "Make me one with everything." That's it, isn't it? I've got it now.
How long have you been waiting to tell that joke?
All through the meditation, Martin.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anything else? We've got time for just one more, I think, before. Hello. Hi, Helen.
Hiya. I've had this, I don't know, with you saying we're connected, we're all
Yes.
connected. I become aware of the space around us that we tend to ignore. Do you think there's a connection is there a connection physically as well as?
That's a good point. I think probably. Because we function as mental and physical beings. I tend to take the view that consciousness and matter, or physical space and physical objects, are two sides of one coin, as well. So, it's certainly true that we are affected by the space that we are in. And that people that we're with, for example, we are often responding unconsciously. In fact, we're sending out cues and signals and things like that. When you were just giving that explanation, it reminded me of something as well. I always remember a tip for meditation. Ajahn Sumedho, who obviously founded Amravati and Chithurst, the two Thai forest lineage monasteries in England, he once said, during meditation, he said, don't just be aware of the thoughts, be aware of the space around the thoughts. And it sort of reminded in the same way, it's a different way of looking. So we tend to focus on objects, not necessarily on the space around and between objects. And I think that's what you're saying in the physical realm, but you can also do that in the mental realm as well. And when you do that, for example, in the sitting, the thoughts still come and go, which is fine. But because we're aware of the space around and between one thought and the next, we're not quite as carried away with the mental object. And I think that the way of seeing physically, so when you walk into a room, when you if you're aware of the space between the objects, you're actually not focusing on a particular object. So you're not sort of thinking, oh God, those windows are mucky. I should have cleaned those. Oh, why didn't I clean them? Or someone should have cleaned them, or whatever. So we tend to get focused on things and then have lots of comments and critics about it. But actually, if you're just aware, but then you can look at the window and say that even the dirt on the window, and you might notice the pattern that it actually makes. And in that way, it sort of counteracts and cuts through that sort of critical narrative that we often fall into.
Yeah. Okay.
That's
Thank you.
interesting. It's just an interesting way of looking at things. Instead of rushing in and then reacting to what's in the room, it allows you to sit back and just looking at the space between things. I think it just allows you to take a little bit of declutched time out and just notice something from a different way of seeing.
Okay, thank you.
Martin, I know you said one more, but Suzanne also had her hand up.
Okay.
Thank you. Martin, you're mentioning empathy. Do you think that perhaps the cause of that empathy between us is because of the total interconnectedness of life and all living things, and the fact that the processes of life are energetic in the electrical field which surrounds everything, and that helps us to have connection and oneness with all other living things?
I'm not. I mean, to be honest, I'm not terribly qualified to speak about that sort of electrical connection. Although, I'm fully aware that all living things produce an electrical field. I mean, it's a measurable thing, and it is definitely a thing. And definitely, there's an interaction as well. I think what I'm more obviously familiar with is the way that the Buddha's teachings frame something very similar. And I think what that gives us, and in a way, the whole energy field things gives us it as well. We tend to think of ourselves as, me. But actually, once you begin to look at things, you can see that there's a lot of things that are interdependent. So, for example, the fact that, even if we just stick with our physical bodies, how we're reliant on, air and food and interaction with our environment. I mean, and if it wasn't for our environment, such as the air we breathe, I mean, in order to have the air we breathe, you have to have a planet. And to have a planet, you have to have a solar system. And to have a solar system, you have to have a galaxy, and you have to have a galaxy cluster, and then you have to have a universe. So all these, we tend to, in our minds, we conceptualize these things down and almost isolate them. Galaxy, solar system, planet, me. But actually, there's a sort of continuum, and you can change that narrative. And rather like, for example, you could think of yourself as a person, but it's also true that you're a colony. You're a colony of cells that are coming to be and ceasing to be for the duration of the life of this organism. And that's a perfectly valid way of seeing it. It's a perfectly true way of seeing yourself. But we don't think of ourselves in that way. We think of ourselves as a person, which is also perfectly valid. So the point is that we sort of become we become identified with certain ways of seeing. And we forget that there may be other ways of seeing. And I think that the energetic model that you're talking about is quite, you could see people in terms just of energy. For example, the energy interacting, and it's it allows you to think in a different way than if you just see yourself as a physical person, and that you end at the surface of your skin, so to speak, and go no further. I don't know if that makes sense or if I'm rambling a bit.
I think the fact that in nature absolutely everything is recycled. Nothing is created and nothing is destroyed. Everything is continually cycled, and the very matter of which anything and everything is made of continues, and it just takes on new forms all the while.
Yes. And I think it's funny. In Zen, in Zen, the term when someone dies, the term that's the colloquial term that's used is undergoing transformation. So they say, "Oh, have you heard so and so underwent transformation?" "Oh no, I didn't know that." So that's how it would be. That's how it would be put, rather than this idea of something stopping, which tends to be. So when we talk about someone dying, we tend to think, "Oh, that person's sort of stopped in time there, and that's it. It's a dead end cul-de-sac." But actually, if you've got something undergoing transformation, it has a different connotation, a different sense to it as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay. I think probably time's getting on. We'd better draw things to a conclusion.
Okay, Martin. Well, thank you so much. And perhaps the next time, as I mentioned earlier, we'll meet in the flesh.
That'd be great.
When, is your center up and running yet? Or
the temple is the Buddhist Society is still. I've just received the middle way, the magazine, and I noticed that they're still keeping everything online.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure why, but anyway, but our temples have opened up.
Well, thank you again. Lovely teaching, as I said, and a donation from ourselves back to your private offshore account, or as always.
Yeah, as long as yes, via Shoboab. That'd be great.
Mum's the word. Okay.
Mum's
Thank you
the
so
word.
much, Martin, and good night to
Our
everybody.
pleasure.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Take care.